You think you can sit there, smirking like you own the world, while the rest of us pretend your hands are clean? Jimmy Kimmel's voice sliced through the air, sharp and venomous, as the audience gasped. The studio, buzzing with anticipation for a routine celebrity chat, froze. Brad Pitt, lounging in the guest chair with his trademark grin, stiffened, his eyes narrowing to slits. The accusation hung heavy, a guillotine waiting to drop. Jimmy leaned forward, his knuckles white on the desk, his usual playful demeanor, replaced by a raw, seething intensity. "I've got names, Brad. Dates. Deals. You want to talk about Hollywood's golden boy? Or should we talk about the secrets you've buried to keep that crown?" the crowd murmured, a mix of shock and unease rippling through the seats. Brad's jaw clenched, his fingers drumming on the armrest, betraying a flicker of unease beneath his polished exterior. He leaned back, forcing a chuckle, but it came out jagged like glass breaking. "Jimmy, you're reaching," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "You think you can drag me through the mud on live TV? You're fishing for headlines, pal." But Jimmy wasn't backing down. His eyes burned with a fire rarely seen on his late-night stage. A man who'd stumbled onto something too big to ignore. He pulled a stack of papers from under his desk, slapping them down with a thud that echoed like a gunshot. "These aren't guesses, Brad. These are contracts, emails, proof. You've been playing gatekeeper for Hollywood's ugliest truths for years." The accusation was a bomb, and the studio felt like ground zero. Brad's face twitched, his charm cracking like cheap plaster. The papers, dog-eared and marked with highlighter, sat between them like a challenge. Jimmy's voice dropped, cold and deliberate. "You've been protecting people, haven't you? The ones who make movies but break lives. The ones who pay to keep their names out of the news. You're not just an actor, Brad. You're a fixer." The audience was silent now, every eye locked on the two men. A woman in the front row clutched her purse, her face pale. A man beside her whispered, "Is this for real?" Brad's smile was gone, replaced by a sneer. He leaned forward, his voice a hiss. "You don't know what you're messing with, Jimmy. You think you're some hero digging up dirt? You're a talk show host. Stick to your cue cards." But Jimmy didn't flinch. He pushed the papers closer, his finger jabbing at a highlighted line. "This one's from 2015. A studio exec. A lawsuit that vanished. Your signature's on the non-disclosure agreement. Care to explain?" Brad's eyes flicked to the papers, then back to Jimmy, calculating. The air crackled with tension, every second, stretching like a taut wire. "You're out of your depth," Brad snapped, his voice rising, a dangerous edge to it. He stood, towering over the desk, his hands balled into fists. "You think you can ambush me? You think this little stunt makes you somebody?" Jimmy rose too, meeting Brad's glare head-on. "I'm not the one hiding, Brad. You've been dodging this for years. Names like yours don't stay clean without help. Who's pulling your strings? Or are you the one pulling theirs?" The audience held its breath, sensing the moment teetering on the edge of chaos. Brad's chest heaved, his face a mask of barely contained rage. Then a low, bitter laugh escaped him. "You're pathetic, Jimmy. You think you've got me cornered? You've got nothing." He grabbed the papers, tearing them in half with a vicious rip, the sound cutting through the silence. The audience gasped again, some leaning forward, others shrinking back. Jimmy didn't move, his eyes locked on Brad's. "Tear them up," he said, his voice steady. "There's more where those came from. You can't bury this forever." Brad froze, the torn papers fluttering to the floor. For a moment it looked like he might lunge across the desk. The studio held its breath, waiting for the explosion. Brad's hand hovered over the desk, the torn papers scattered like confetti from a broken promise. His eyes, wild with fury, locked onto Jimmy's unyielding stare. The audience, caught in the suffocating tension, barely dared to breathe. A producer in the wings signaled frantically to cut to commercial, but Jimmy waved him off without breaking eye contact. "You can't run from this, Brad," he said, his voice low but piercing, like a blade sliding between ribs. "You've been playing this game too long. People deserve to know who you really protect." Brad's lips curled into a snarl, his voice dripping with venom. "You're a nobody, Kimmel. A clown with a microphone. You think you can take me down?" Jimmy stepped around the desk, closing the distance between them, his face inches from Brad's. The move was bold, almost reckless, and the crowd murmured, sensing the confrontation barreling toward a breaking point. "A nobody," Jimmy said, his voice steady but laced with rage. "I'm the guy who's got evidence you helped cover up a scandal that ruined lives. You signed off on silencing victims, Brad. You made sure the truth stayed buried." He pointed to the floor where the shredded papers lay. "Those were just copies. The originals are with people who aren't afraid of you." Brad's face paled for a split second, a crack in his armor, but he recovered fast, his fists clenching tighter. "You're bluffing," Brad spat, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger. He shoved a finger in Jimmy's face, close enough to make the host flinch, though Jimmy held his ground. "You don't have the guts to go through with this. You know what happens to people who cross the wrong names in this town." The threat hung heavy, and a woman in the audience gasped, audibly, her hand covering her mouth. Jimmy's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're not scaring me, Brad. I've talked to people you've silenced. Assistants, actors, crew members. They're done being afraid. They're ready to talk." Brad laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the studio. He turned to the audience, arms spread wide, playing to the crowd like the seasoned performer he was. "You hear this guy? He thinks he's got a conspiracy. Thinks I'm some villain in a movie." But the crowd wasn't buying it. Their murmurs turned to uneasy whispers, some shaking their heads, others glaring at Brad with newfound suspicion. His charm, once effortless, was unraveling. Jimmy seized the moment, his voice rising with conviction. "You're not a villain in a movie, Brad. You're worse. You're real. You've been brokering deals to protect predators, and I've got the receipts." The accusation landed like a punch, and Brad's facade cracked further. He stepped closer, his voice a low growl. "You're gonna regret this, Jimmy. You have no idea what you're stirring up." But Jimmy didn't back down. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a single photograph, and held it up for the cameras. It showed Brad at a private meeting, shaking hands with a notorious studio head known for dodging allegations for years. The audience erupted in murmurs, some shouting in disbelief. "This was taken 3 years ago," Jimmy said, his voice cutting through the noise. "You were there when they buried another case. You helped make it disappear." Brad's eyes widened just for a moment before he swatted the photo from Jimmy's hand. It fluttered to the floor, landing near the torn papers. "That's nothing," he roared, his voice raw with desperation. "You're twisting everything." But the crowd was turning, their murmurs growing louder, angrier. A man in the back row stood, pointing at Brad. "Tell the truth," he shouted, and others joined in, a chorus of demands swelling. Brad's head snapped toward the audience, his face a mix of shock and fury. He wasn't used to this, being cornered, exposed, challenged. Jimmy stepped back, letting the crowd's energy fill the room. "You can't charm your way out of this." He said, his voice calm but relentless. "The truth's coming out, Brad. You can tear up papers, you can threaten me, but you can't stop what's already started." Brad's chest heaved, his eyes darting from Jimmy to the audience to the cameras, searching for an escape. For the first time, the man who'd always controlled the narrative looked trapped, his empire of secrets crumbling under the weight of a single accusation. The studio pulsed with raw energy, the audience's shouts echoing like a storm gathering strength. Brad Pitt stood frozen, his eyes darting between the hostile crowd and Jimmy Kimmel, who stood calm but unyielding, a man who'd lit a fuse and wasn't backing away. The photograph lay crumpled on the floor, its image burned into the minds of everyone watching. Brad shaking hands with a man whose name was synonymous with Hollywood's darkest scandals. Brad's chest rose and fell rapidly, his composure fraying, like a rope about to snap. "You're making a mistake," he hissed, his voice low, almost pleading, but laced with a threat that made the front row lean back. "You think you're untouchable? You're digging your own grave." Jimmy didn't blink. He crossed his arms, his voice steady as steel. "The only one in a hole here is you, Brad. You've been burying the truth for years, but it's crawling out now. People are talking, witnesses, victims. They're not afraid anymore." He turned to the audience, his gaze sweeping over them, drawing them in. "You want to know why cases disappear in this town? Why powerful people walk free? Ask Brad. He's been the middleman, making sure the right hands get greased." The crowd roared, a mix of boos and demands for answers, their voices crashing like waves against Brad's crumbling defenses. Brad's face twisted, his voice rising to a shout. "You're lying! You've got nothing but rumors and fake photos." He jabbed a finger toward Jimmy, his body trembling with rage. "You're trying to ruin me, and for what? Ratings? You're pathetic." But the accusation rang hollow. The audience wasn't swayed. Their boos grew louder, sharper, cutting through Brad's defiance. A woman in the third row stood, her voice piercing the chaos. "What about the people you hurt, Brad? What about them?" The question hit like a slap, and for a moment Brad's eyes flickered with something. Guilt, fear, or maybe just the shock of being called out so publicly. Jimmy seized the moment, his voice rising with a fierce clarity. "She's right. This isn't about me or my show. This is about the people you've helped silence, the ones who tried to speak up and got crushed. You signed their stories away, Brad. You made sure they stayed quiet." He reached under the desk again, pulling out a small, worn notebook. He held it up, its pages yellowed and creased. "This belonged to a costume designer who worked on one of your films. She wrote everything, dates, meetings, payoffs. Your name's all over it." The audience gasped, the sound swelling into a collective murmur of disbelief and anger. Brad lunged forward, trying to snatch the notebook, but Jimmy yanked it back, his eyes blazing. "Don't even try," he snapped. "This isn't going away. You can't tear this up or scare it off." Brad's hand froze mid-air, his face a mask of desperation. He turned to the audience, his voice cracking. "You're all falling for this. He's playing you. This is a setup." But his words drowned in the crowd's growing fury. A man shouted, "We're not stupid, Pitt." Another yelled, "Tell the truth." The studio felt like a powder keg, ready to explode. Jimmy stepped closer, his voice dropping to a chilling calm. "You've got one chance, Brad. Come clean, right now. Tell the world what you've done, who you've protected, or I'll do it for you." The ultimatum hung heavy, the air thick with anticipation. Brad's eyes darted to the exit, then back to Jimmy, his hands shaking. For a moment it seemed he might break, might spill the secrets he'd guarded so fiercely. But then his face hardened, and he stepped back, his voice a low growl. "You're finished, Kimmel. You hear me? Finished." He turned, shoving past the desk, his shoulder brushing Jimmy as he stormed toward the stage's edge, the audience jeering at his back. The crowd's boos followed him, relentless, as he disappeared into the wings. Jimmy stood alone, the notebook, still in his hand, his expression a mix of resolve and exhaustion. He turned to the audience, his voice soft but firm. "This isn't over, not by a long shot. The truth's coming, whether he likes it or not." The crowd erupted in cheers, their anger shifting to support, a wave of solidarity washing over the room. Jimmy glanced at the notebook, then at the empty space where Brad had stood, knowing the battle was far from won but feeling the weight of a truth finally breaking free. Backstage, the air was thick with chaos. The echo of the audience's cheers still ringing through the walls as Brad Pitt stormed down the narrow hallway, his footsteps heavy, his face a storm of rage and panic. Crew members scattered, pressing themselves against the walls to avoid his path, their eyes wide with the weight of what they'd just witnessed. He shoved open a dressing room door, slamming it behind him, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. Inside, he paced, his hands raking through his hair, muttering curses. Under his breath, "Kimmel thinks he's got me," he growled to no one, his voice raw. "He's got nothing. Nothing." But his eyes betrayed him, darting to the mirror, where his own reflection stared back. A man unraveling, a king losing his throne. Outside, Jimmy stood on the stage, the notebook still clutched in his hand, the audience's cheers fading into a tense hum of anticipation. He looked out at them, his face set with determination, but his voice softened, carrying a weight of responsibility. "Folks, what you saw tonight wasn't just a fight. It's about accountability, about people who've been hurt, silenced, pushed aside. I'm not done yet." He held up the notebook, its worn cover a symbol of buried truths. "This is just the start. There's more, and I'm going to make sure it gets out." The crowd erupted again, their applause a roar of support. But Jimmy's eyes flicked to the wings, where a producer whispered urgently into a headset, signaling trouble. In the dressing room, Brad's phone buzzed relentlessly on the counter, ignored as he paced, his mind racing. He knew the notebook wasn't a bluff. Jimmy had the real thing, pages filled with names, dates, and deals he'd thought were buried forever. He'd been careful, always working through intermediaries, keeping his hands clean in public. But that costume designer, she'd been too observant, too stubborn, scribbling down every meeting, every hushed conversation. He'd underestimated her, and now Jimmy had her words. Brad slammed his fist against the wall, the pain grounding him for a moment. "I'll bury him," he muttered. "I'll bury them all." On stage, Jimmy handed the notebook to a stagehand, instructing her to keep it safe. He faced the audience again, his voice steady but urgent. "Brad thinks he can walk away from this, but he's wrong. I've got people ready to come forward, people he can't intimidate anymore." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Tomorrow, I'm meeting with a lawyer who's been collecting stories from people Brad's network silenced. We're going public, and we're not stopping." The crowd cheered, but a sharp voice cut through from the side. A producer, red-faced, rushing onto the stage. "Jimmy, we've got a problem. He's threatening to sue. Says he's calling his lawyers right now." Jimmy's jaw tightened, but he waved the producer off, turning back to the audience. "Let him sue. I'm not scared of his lawyers or his threats. The truth doesn't bend to money." The crowd roared again, their voices a wall of defiance. But backstage, Brad was already on the phone, his voice low and venomous. "Get me Ellison," he snapped, naming a powerful attorney known for making problems disappear. "Tell him it's urgent. Kimmel's got dirt, and he's not stopping. We need to shut this down now." He hung up, his hands shaking, knowing the clock was ticking. The stagehand, clutching the notebook, slipped into a quiet corner of the studio, her heart pounding. She'd overheard Brad's call, caught the name Ellison, and knew what it meant. Trouble, the kind that could crush Jimmy's crusade before it began. She hesitated, then pulled out her phone, texting a contact she'd met during a whistleblower's interview. "Jimmy needs help. Pitt's calling in favors. We've got to move fast." On stage, Jimmy wrapped up, his voice ringing with conviction. "We're going to keep fighting, for the people who've been silenced, for the truth. Stay with us." The audience stood, their applause thunderous, a promise of solidarity as the show cut to commercial. Brad, still in the dressing room, stared at his phone, waiting for Ellison's call. His empire was cracking, but he wasn't done fighting. He'd built his name on charm and power, and he'd do whatever it took to keep it. But outside, the world was shifting. The voices he'd silenced growing louder, and Jimmy Kimmel, the clown with a microphone, was leading the charge, unafraid and unrelenting. The studio hummed with the fading echo of applause as the commercial break began, but the fight was far from over. Jimmy Kimmel stood in the wings, his face set with resolve, the stagehand's urgent whisper still ringing in his ears. Brad was calling in heavy hitters, and the clock was ticking. He clutched the notebook tighter, its pages a lifeline to the truth he'd vowed to expose. A runner approached, breathless, holding a phone. "It's the lawyer," she said. "She's got news." Jimmy nodded, stepping into a quiet corner, his heart pounding as he answered. "Tell me you've got something," he said, his voice low but firm. The lawyer's voice crackled through, steady and sharp. "We've got 3 more witnesses ready to go public. They're naming names. Jimmy, Brad's at the center of it all." Back in the dressing room, Brad's phone finally lit up with Ellison's name. He answered, his voice a harsh whisper. "You better have a plan, because Kimmel's coming for blood." Ellison's tone was cold, calculated. "We can bury this, but it's messy. Lawsuits, injunctions, maybe a counter-story to discredit him. You need to stay calm and deny everything." Brad's laugh was bitter, his hands shaking as he gripped the phone. "Calm? He's got a notebook full of my life, Ellison. Dates, deals, everything. If that gets out, I'm done." Ellison paused, then said, "Then we make sure it doesn't. I'm sending people to the studio now. Stall him." Brad hung up, his eyes wild, knowing his empire was on the brink. On stage, the show resumed, the audience buzzing with anticipation. Jimmy returned, his expression fierce but composed. He held up a hand, silencing the crowd. "We're not done," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Brad Pitt walked off this stage, but he can't walk away from the truth. I've just spoken to a lawyer who's been working with people hurt by Hollywood's secrets. People Brad helped silence." He paused, letting the weight settle. "Tonight we're breaking that silence." The crowd roared, their voices a tide of support, but Jimmy's eyes flicked to the wings, where the stagehand signaled urgently, mouthing, "They're here." 2 men in suits, Ellison's fixers, pushed through the backstage crowd, their faces hard. The stagehand intercepted them, her voice steady despite her fear. "You can't go out there. This is a live show." One of them sneered, "We're here for Pitt. Step aside." But the stagehand held her ground, clutching the notebook behind her back. "You're too late," she said, nodding toward the stage where Jimmy was already speaking. "He's got backups. The truth's already out." The men hesitated, their confidence shaken, as Jimmy's voice boomed through the studio. "I've got names," Jimmy said, his voice rising with conviction. "Witnesses who've signed affidavits, ready to testify about the deals Brad brokered. To protect powerful people. They're not afraid anymore, and neither am I." He held up a USB drive, small but damning. "This has everything. Copies of the notebook, recordings, emails. It's going to the press tonight." The audience erupted, their cheers shaking the room, a collective demand for justice. Backstage, the fixers froze, realizing they were outmaneuvered. The stagehand slipped away, texting her contact again. "It's done. The files are safe." Brad, watching from a monitor in the dressing room, felt the walls closing in. His phone buzzed with messages, colleagues, agents, all distancing themselves, sensing the tide turning. He sank into a chair, his face ashen, the weight of his actions crashing down. He'd built a fortress of secrets, but Jimmy had torn it apart, piece by piece. On stage, Jimmy faced the cameras, his voice steady. "This isn't about me. It's about the people who've been silenced, who've waited years for someone to listen. Tonight, we listened." The crowd stood, their applause a thunderous wave, a promise that the truth would no longer be buried. As the show ended, Jimmy walked off stage, handing the USB drive to the lawyer waiting in the wings. "Get this out there," he said. "Make sure it sticks." She nodded, her eyes fierce. "It will. We've got him." Outside, the audience spilled onto the street, their voices alive with excitement, sharing stories of the night Hollywood's golden boy fell. Brad, alone in the dressing room, stared at his reflection, knowing his reign was over. The truth had won, and Jimmy Kimmel, the man he'd called a nobody, had brought it to light, unyielding, triumphant, and unstoppable.